Hey out there everyone, my name is Chris, also known as CV, and welcome to my channel. Well, continuing on with this series, let's talk about covenant. We will now look at various types of covenants, Abraham as an example of entering into covenant with God, and the relationship between the Hebrew terms Berit and Hesed, and Hesed is spelled H-E-S-E-D. Keep in mind throughout this series that while the information we are covering goes into some theological depth about covenants and Jewish beliefs overall, all of this will lead to concrete, crucial reasons about why keeping with covenant could very well save humanity. Now let's continue on here. So with Abraham as an example, and which further illustrates the Hebrews incorporating covenants into their culture, Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3 gives an overview of the covenant that God formed with Abraham: land, offspring, and blessings. However, because a ritual did not ensue after the initial conversation between God and Abraham, scholars view this chapter as a prelude to the covenant soon to be formalized. It is in Genesis chapter 15 and 17 where the covenant between God and Abraham, first known as Abram, is formally declared. And these two chapters, while similar in explaining what the covenant entailed, have separate angles as well. In Genesis 15, it appears God first declares his role in the covenant, secures his relationship with Abraham, and expects Abraham's faith in the covenant. Chapter 17, on the other hand, not only restates the covenant and gives further details, it also hones in on Abraham's responsibility to the covenant. In short, some scholars have even referred to Genesis 15 as, quote, faith, and Genesis 17 as, quote, responsibility. Scholarly community, however, does not have a consensus on the similarities and the differences between chapter 15 and 17. Some scholars believe that Genesis 15 and 17 detail separate yet related covenants, while other scholars see the two chapters as one covenant that is progressively explained, that 17 essentially confirms 15. The bottom line, though, is when Genesis 15 and 17 are combined, God indeed formed a covenant with Abraham, and it included what was foretold in Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 3, land and offspring. So what becomes abundantly clear here, and this is the overarching point, is there is no shortage of covenant talk in the Torah. Prior to Abraham, God had established a covenant, Bérit, with Noah, and it is the first time the word Bérit is used in Scripture. Then, after God's covenant with Abraham, God continued to form covenants with other patriarchs, including Moses and Aaron and David, to name a few. In fact, in the book Interpreting Ancient Israelite History, Prophecy, and Law, the authors John H. Hayes and Dr. Brad Kelle explain that covenant context falls into one of the following categories: God's covenants with individuals, God's covenant with Israel, covenants between human civilizations, later prophets' perspectives on the covenant between God and Israel, marriage itself as a covenant, and the mention of a future covenant that will transform the Jewish people and their home, Israel. Now here are some examples to illustrate those covenant categories. So starting with God's covenant with individuals. In Numbers chapter 18, verses 21 through 24, God forms a covenant with Moses' brother Aaron regarding priestly responsibilities. And Phinehas, Aaron's grandson, was bound to a covenant of priesthood in Numbers chapter 25, verses 10 through 13. An example of God's covenant with Israel. This is a flagship covenant with the Hebrews, who would become Israelites after the Exodus from Egypt, and said covenant delivered to Moses on Mount Sinai. And this is a core covenant to Judaism. That covenant, the covenant between Moses and God at Mount Sinai. Now, covenants between humans. What's an example of that? Well, in 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1, the Jabesh Gilead people create a covenant with Nahash the Ammonite. Now, an example of prophets referring to covenants, Hosea refers to covenants between Israel and other states in Hosea chapter 10, verse 4. Now, how about the covenant of marriage? Well, in Malachi chapter 3, verse 14, God witnesses a marriage and calls the wife a covenant woman. In addition, Proverbs chapter 2, verse 17 begins to describe the consequences for a woman who ignores the Berit made with her husband, or the covenant made with her husband. And finally, last example about God's future covenant, another type of covenant, Isaiah chapter 61, verse 8, and Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 40, speak of an everlasting transformative covenant with Israel and its people. Now, although the term for covenant, the Hebrew term for covenant, Bérit, is at the forefront of learning how the Torah was conceived and compiled, Hesed, again that's spelled H-E-S-E-D, a term with definitions ranging from kindness and mercy to loyalty and faithfulness, appears to have a symbiotic relationship with Bérit. In fact, although several other terms, for example, shalom, peace, and even the word ben, B-E-N, father and son, also have a relationship with Bérit. Hesed stands as interconnected with Bérit. That is, while Bérit establishes the oath between two parties, Hesed may mean being devoted to the Bérit. Another way to put it is Bérit and Hesed reflect a master and protege relationship. The protege is loyal to the master for providing the covenant, and this mutual relationship reinforces the connection between humankind and God. Additionally, because Hesed is closely linked with Bérit, Hesed for the Hebrews, and for the Hebrews and then Israelites, was not only about being faithful to the covenant itself, but also recognizing Yahweh as their ultimate authority who supersedes any non-divine, human-to-human covenants that also have a Bérit to Hesed relationship. Now, however, as with the scholarship on Bérit, there is some debate about how to apply the rather broad range of definitions for Hesed. Modern scholarship suggests that Hesed may apply more to legal covenants and not necessarily to the covenants between God and the patriarchs. Therefore, Hesed may have less to do with kindness and more about loyalty. Still, other scholarship stands by Hesed being used to denote kindness and mercy, as in 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 8, in which David forms a friendship covenant with Jonathan and expects Hesed, in this case translated to kindness, in return. Now, in part 4, we will take all that we've explored about covenant history and types and show how God's revelation relates to them. Now, I know in part 3, we did cover some theological depth, and disclaimer I gave in the beginning of this video, although we are covering some of that, and to give you some more foundation and understanding of, again, the history of covenant and types of covenants. Just keep in mind, again, that this is, again, just all part of giving a foundation for the greater point that we're going to make here in the next 2 videos, again, about God's revelation, how this relates to covenants. That's definitely a cap to this video series. And then finally, how this applies to today and how covenant is definitely a topic we must discuss now, and how it very much is rooted in Christian faith, and how it, again, very much could resolve some of the struggles we have as Christians, and Christians, between each other, and also just with the secular world out there, and some of the challenges and hot button topics that we're facing right now. I appreciate you watching this video. As always, feel free to leave comments. Please participate in the conversation. You're also welcome to email me at trcatholic@gmail.com. Again, trcatholic@gmail.com. And until the next video, stay safe out there, and God bless.